Thanks, Paul. Thanks so much for the invite. Thanks to Anne. Thanks to Leslie as well, and to all of you for joining this afternoon. So this is really exciting to sort of extend on some of this work that Paul and I started that we were excited about a few years ago, and see some of it come to fruition. Today, I'll be talking about some on-farm soil health testing that we carried out in Michigan. And just thinking about how we can go from a lot of controlled studies of thinking about soil health to the realities of on-farm. And I won't spend a lot of time on intro given this audience, but I'll just say that we're in sort of a currently in a paradigm shift of soil testing, and the sort of past paradigm, or paradigm that's maybe receding a little bit, has had its own set of both benefits, a lot of productivity, a focus on nutrient intensive additions and to cropping systems, but it's had drawbacks too, particularly in, it's very visible in Michigan, but also throughout the Midwest in terms of just focusing on nutrient additions in particular. And it's kind of given way to this transition that we're all probably participating in at some level, which is the transition towards a soil health paradigm, which integrates not just chemical features, but physical and biological. And it's really taken hold at not just the level of soil health testing, but thinking about whole farm management, the potential for profitability, and thus, is much bigger in my view than just an approach to testing, right? It's a whole sort of change in the idea of how we think about managing resources on farm, whether they be economic or natural resources or human resources. What got me interested beyond just the soil testing aspect is I've done a lot of work on really, in some ways, immaculate field sites that provide a great opportunity to do basic research. As Paul mentioned, I did quite a bit of work on Kellogg Biological Station at one point, and these stations are just great for looking at really fine scale differences between how we manage cropping systems. So in this case, this isn't a soil health measure per se, but in a way, it's sort of an integrator of soil measurement in the same way that a soil health measure might be, which is global warming potential. And in a comparison across similar cropping systems in the sense of rotation, this is corn, soy, wheat rotation, we can see that there are broadly large level differences that we can really pinpoint and pull apart in a controlled field study like this and compare to other systems like a perennial system or the system that's under different management like early succession forest. And the kind of take home point here is that these types of studies have been great for letting metrics for soil health emerge and really understanding how different managements control the way that soil responds and how we can measure those differences using soil health metrics. However, as we all know, this is a little different from what occurs on farm where we don't have controlled studies. There's a lot more variability. And so that's what really got me interested in working on Michigan farms, talking with Paul and some of the other extension folks in Michigan to really test these tests on farm, sort of testing the soil health test. And it's great if we can pick them up when we do controlled field studies on nice field sites, but what's happening on farms? And so on working farms, it gives us the opportunity to really assess the sensitivity of soil health testing and indicators in particular across fields, across soil types, and hopefully can act as a guide for new research questions. So I think research questions should be emerging on these nice field sites, but also I think testing these metrics on farm or field sites can also provide a great opportunity both to let new questions emerge, but also help us identify how we can better serve farmers, either through recommendations or extension. So we set out to try and quantify variability of on-farm soil health scores across three regions in Michigan. And we wanted to evaluate the degree to which soil health parameters aligned with farmers' own assessments of their fields. So farmers have this deep knowledge of what's happening across their farms and different fields, and strong opinions often on how one field performs over a different field. And we had a numerous questions, but one thing we hypothesized was that soil health should be able to pick up physical and biological soil health indicators that align with how farmers assess their own fields. Hopefully, if soil health is going to act as a paradigm that can, for soil testing, that can guide farmers into the future, it can pick up differences across farmer fields, and likely it would not be as effective in picking up chemical differences, in part due to the fact that these are the farmers that we surveyed are great farmers. They're following their own recommendations for soil testing already, and probably they're treating their fields similarly. So we set out to do this with a simple survey across 3 regions of Michigan: a north, a central, and a south region, to try and pick up differences in soil type, differences in climate, and we selected numerous farms across these 3 regions. The soils were not dramatically different, but I think served as a good survey for this small region. So in the north, we had sort of frigid soils that were high in alkalinity. In the central region, we had more poorly drained soils that were heavier, had a little bit heavier clay. In the south region, generally they were highly sandy soils, outwash plains, and they were slightly more acidic. And for each grower, we asked them to select 4 fields, a best field. We didn't ask them how they've made that basis for comparison. We just said, give us your best field, give us your worst field. A non-row crop field. This also varied a little bit in what it was. And then a choice field. They could pick any field that they wanted on their farm. This gave us a good collection of different contrasting field types that we could use to, again, test the soil health test itself. And as opposed to maybe a survey that we might do if we wanted to inform a grower, we didn't ask too many more questions ahead of time. Rather, we had a follow-up interview to get into more details about the testing results and the characteristics of the individual fields themselves. So after we'd had these early discussions with farmers and with help from folks like Paul, we surveyed each field and established what different soil types predominated, and surveyed them accordingly to get a best representative sample. We took the soil samples, submitted some to the standard soil testing lab, and carried out a lot of the soil health test ourselves. Together, we had about 50 fields that we ultimately sampled, and we used that to create to standardize a score for each metric, and for soil health metric, an overall soil health metric in general, to compare across regions and within regions and across regions. So just briefly, I'll give you a little bit of insight on how farmers ultimately selected their fields when we followed up with an interview, and how the fields were being managed. So by and large, farmers chose fields based on how well they yielded. So their best field and their worst field determined their field selection. Their high yielding or versus low yielding determined their best and worst field selection. And beyond that, a lot of them focused on some level of how the soil worked, its reliability, its drainage. Oftentimes, drainage was associated with things like how easy it is to get in and out of the field. And what struck me about this, in a way, was, in thinking about this idea of different soil testing paradigms, farmers are already integrating in the sense that, in the similar way that we integrate with soil health, right? How a soil works is an integrated way of thinking about one's field, or the reliability. That might integrate a lot of different things. So already I was thinking, well, this is a basis for comparison for thinking about things like physical factors and physical soil health factors in soil. So then just briefly, I'll just point out that a lot of these fields, again, thinking mostly about best and worst fields, they were managed similarly, both in terms of tillage, in terms of the crop rotation, Across the top here, you have the regions and then the different farm numbers. So each box here corresponds to a different field type based on red or blue, and then how the field was managed. There was not a clear pattern in terms of tillage approach, cropping approach, or even things like manure addition in the past or present based on field type. So we knew going in that we weren't able to control how these fields were managed. We were really using the feedback from the farmers as our sort of experimental design, and then from there we would be able to pick out some of these results. So here's just a quick overview of the soil health by region, and this summarizes physical health, biological health, chemical health, and then the overall soil health. And what we found was that really there was only one region, the northern region, where there was a strongly statistical difference between best and worst fields. There were differences with the NRC or non-row crop field, which might not be terribly surprising. But there were differences, certainly numerical differences between best and worst fields at the sort of coarse level of thinking about regional differences in field type. If we dig in a little bit further and we look at key metrics, really the key metrics that differentiated the fields were not, as we had sort of predicted, not the chemical differences between field types based on NPK or traditional soil testing. They came down to physical and biological measures. So if we dig in a little bit further, the available water capacity, things like permanganate oxidizable carbon, potentially mineralizable carbon or mineralizable carbon, and potentially mineralizable nitrogen were much stronger at predicting differences between best and worst fields in particular. So once we break them down by metric, we could see a little bit more that there were regional differences, and not only that, but there were stronger patterns in between best and worst fields. But the strength of the study really was that we had individual farms where we could make pairwise comparisons, which was kind of our whole intent. So this is a large table, and I'll try and highlight the points that we can make when we look at pairwise comparisons. So in other words, within farm, looking at best and worst fields. So what jumps out is when we just look at this difference between best and worst fields, in this case, the physical and biological differences are strongly significant. And so within a field, a farmer is really able to, based on his judgment of best and worst fields, is picking out something that we can assess using soil health in a reliable way. And that comes down to a couple key metrics that were pretty consistent throughout each region. Available water capacity was always a central metric, pretty much for every farm that was reliable in terms of assessing soil health. Soil organic matter, not surprisingly, was another strong indicator. Interestingly, I pointed out at the coarse level of sort of taking averages across region that permanganate oxidizable carbon and potentially mineralizable nitrogen were good predictors. But when we look at it at the pairwise level, mineralizable carbon really jumps out as within a farm distinguishing between soil, something that has stronger soil health. And interestingly, potentially mineralizable nitrogen falls out of significance. So when we looked at it at the county level and we just said, okay, let's aggregate best and worst fields, potentially mineralizable nitrogen looks like something that's going to be highly predictive and useful as a maybe for recommendations on farm or for guiding management. But at the level of the farm, it dropped out of significance. We focused in also on these sort of three metrics of carbon because we were interested in how to assess these and how, particularly on working farms, how these measures of soil organic matter, mineralizable carbon, and permanganate oxidizable carbon, three metrics that are in high use for soil health measures, how they compared across farms. And in general, soil organic matter was total or percent was reliable across farms, and on average about 13% difference between best and worst farms. But by far the mineralizable percent mineralizable carbon, the percent difference was much stronger. On average, 45% difference between best and worst fields. So this was a really strong indicator. Interestingly, when we looked at the comparison for, let's say, a non-row crop field, it wasn't necessarily that much stronger. Really, the contrast between best and worst was the strongest contrast between mineralizable carbon. And permanganate oxidizable carbon was the poorest indicator for this on-farm testing approach. It's not really shown here, it's shown in the earlier table, but POC was much higher on the non-row crop field as it was for the best field. So it seems to reflect this management that you might see under a more perennial type of management, like a forest or a buffer strip or hay, but it didn't reflect differences between best and worst fields in the way that mineralizable carbon did. So I'll try to wrap up relatively quickly because I know we want to get to questions, but just a quick summary of results. The overall soil health scores were higher on the best fields. And in other words, we kind of confirmed that the soil health tests were pretty good at matching or aligning with farmer judgments of field types. These differed by metric, however. The results for the sort of traditional soil health testing did not show strong differences. In fact, in some cases, phosphorus was kind of an erroneous result because it was high enough to score poorly and drive scores down on best fields. And we also found that this paired approach to testing fields was much more effective in follow-up discussions with farmers, as opposed to knowing what's happening regionally. Looking at different fields on their farms provided for a much better sort of discussion of results and how they might manage fields differently. So we really took home that farmer knowledge is really important for boosting how we think about testing and interpreting results on fields. We were also pretty surprised to see how strongly measures of carbon depended on the CO2 flux we were measuring on fields rather than POC or some of these other short-term labile estimates of carbon. And the most accurate measures really differed by region, but those metrics also differed based on farmer input. If we had just randomly selected fields, I think we would have had a different picture than if we had asked farmers to select best and worst fields. So thinking about going forward, I appreciate much more that the need to integrate knowledge when thinking about soil health testing on farms. Farmer knowledge, scales of farms, regional importance, like many of you maybe on the call, I consume lots of papers about how we can think about the importance of management for achieving different types of carbon practices or regenerative practices or soil health practices. And thinking about how these may vary based on farm, I think is critical to achieving a lot of the goals that we know emanate from research, but really where the rubber hits the road on farm, it's a much more nuanced question. So with that, I'll leave it there. I hope for discussion. There's a lot more little components to the study I'm happy to discuss, but for now, I'll ask you to shoot me any questions. And in the meantime, thank particularly my collaborator, Christine Sprunger, all the farmers, Paul Gross, of course, and other collaborators, Colleen Forestieri, James DeDecker, and other folks who helped with this study.